The bus shelter hummed with the low, indifferent noise of a city afternoon. Tires on wet asphalt, the distant chime of a tram, people scrolling through screens under their umbrellas. A woman stood half inside the shelter, coat collar up, breath fogging in the between-season chill. Her hands trembled when she smoothed a small backpack on the bench and straightened the cap on the boy beside her. He was 7, maybe 8, with a smudge of dirt on one cheek and a look that mixed boredom and trust. An ordinary look that a parent sees 100 times a day and never expects to test. She had told herself she'd only go down the block for a moment. She had told herself she would be back before the next bus. The truth lived under those little lies like a weight. 3 months out of work, the landlord's last letter folded into the pocket of her jacket, a refrigerator that vibrated like an accusation, a phone that kept going to voicemail. That morning, the agency had closed its doors, and with them, any tidy plan. After an interview that had gone nowhere, she felt something in her chest unthreading. Shame, a cold, exacting kind that made decisions so small and final. For the boy, the weight stretched into a kind of curiosity. He fiddled with the zipper on his backpack, set his sneakers down on the damped pavement, watched a dog pull its person past the shelter. He did not yet understand the calculus of adult failure. He only knew the steady rituals: breakfast when there was food, a story at night when there was someone to tell it, the slight, flickering hope that today a grown-up would laugh and the world would be right. She stood up, smoothing her hands over the coat as if that could iron out what she was about to do. Her feet moved without fanfare, not running, not dramatic, just walking one step and another toward the corner. She did not look back until the street swallowed her. The boy shouted after an imagined reason she might turn. "Mom?" he asked into the breath-white air. No answer came. A taxi whooshed by. Someone coughed. An advertisement on the bus shelter glinted, and a woman, across the way, smoked, eyes glazed with her own small troubles. From the other side of the street, a man in a well-cut navy coat had been watching the city pass like anyone else, routine, filtered through a pair of expensive lenses. He had the kind of calm that comes with habituated wealth, the rhythm of an account manager's schedule, lunches at a certain roomed table, the belief that most problems, with the right call, could be moved. He noticed the abandoned smallness the way some people notice flowers, not out of pity, but because it contradicts the expected pattern. The child looked like he was waiting for someone who would never return. The man crossed. He knelt with a gentle, practiced care, asked the boy his name, then found out there was no easy answer to where his mother had gone. He called the number printed on a faded ID card the child kept folded in his backpack, and when no one answered, he called the local shelter, then the transit authorities, then, because sometimes life hands a man the choice to act, he stayed until someone from Child Services could take the boy somewhere safe. He introduced himself as Michael Archer. He was not ostentatious in that moment. Wet hair from the drizzle clung to his temple. His briefcase lay on the ground like an incongruous island of normalcy. He spoke in a voice that gave the child the smallest anchor. "We'll make sure you're warm," he said. And for the boy, no longer tethered to the frantic logic of an adult's shame, those words were enough. Sometimes the world shifts because one person decides to stay. If this is a story that pulls at you, hold on. There's a long way to go. Can a parent ever make up for the choice to walk away? Years later, when the boy had a new name stitched into his school sweater and a room that was too bright with sunlight, some mornings he would wake with the echo of that day like a small shape behind his ribs. He grew into a child who liked numbers like others liked stories, patient, precise, delighted by patterns. Puzzles were a kind of miracle for him. Equations were the language in which the world drew its secret lines. Michael and his partner, Evelyn, who loved the feral way children tossed their heads when laughing, took the boy home after the official papers were signed. They paid for tutors, they sat through parent-teacher nights, they read by the bedside lamp until the boy fell asleep. Their house, large and a little clumsy with expensive furniture, learned to hold noise. The small rituals became steady. A hand on the shoulder before dinner, a bowl of cereal on the counter that was always available, homework carefully checked, the same goodnight song hummed until it felt like a safe spell. There were other things money could not fix. The boy, Jonah, as they chose to call him, carried a certain spare grief like a pocket in his chest. He would sometimes pause mid-play to look at his mother's old photograph tucked into the bottom of his backpack, a woman smiling like someone who still hoped. He loved Michael and Evelyn with the ferocity of someone who had been given another life, and he loved them as he loved warm bread, nourishing, obvious. But the other love, the origin of his smallness, existed as an ache that did not cancel the new bonds, but made them more luminous, like a lamp whose light cuts clearer when there is darkness around it. Michael never made the story into a moral. He kept the truth simple and age-appropriate when people asked. A hard time in the child's early life, a stranger's kindness, a new family. The legalities that followed, the paperwork, the hearings, the days the social worker visited, were bureaucratic scaffolding around something tender and enormous. For Jonah, the adoption meant learning lessons about belonging that sometimes arrived late and awkward. A social worker calling him son in a way that asked him to accept it. Classmates using the word home as if it had only one meaning. Meanwhile, across the map of their lives, the woman who had left that afternoon lived somewhere that time had not been kind to. Claire, her name, kept a rhythm of small, painful truths. The furnace no longer worked. She learned to sleep in shifts on couches. Strangers' pity in soup kitchens lodged like stones in her throat. She would not tell the story easily. It started with a job cutting hours until the hours were only ghosts, with a landlord who spoke with the clipped mercy of someone who has long since been paid by people like her to be patient no longer. It ended, if endings can be neat, with the kind of decision that is not heroic and not criminal, merely human and terrible in its consequences. She lived with a constancy of regret that was not fiery but grindstone slow. Some nights she sat on the floor of a borrowed flat and let the darkness hold everything sharp. She would touch the seam of the little backpack and remember the child's small hand against hers, the smell of bread on his breath, the way his hair lay like a soft cloud against a pillow he could no longer reach. That memory alone could be a gravity pulling her through days. Claire tried to find work. She walked up and down streets in a scrub coat, handed out resumes, took temp assignments that paid in pennies, and shook her confidence. She was turned down because she could not produce a stable address. She was denied because a background check showed a late rent or a court letter she couldn't contest. The city felt like a filter that slowly removed her edges until she was raw. Humiliation is not loud in the way movies think. It is a slow thing, a series of small refusals. Not being able to buy a coat that fits, overhearing someone talk about those people, waiting in lines that used to be merciful. Shame gathers like rain in places that then leak. Claire began to see herself reflected in windows with a softness that she had not known before. Older, wearier, eyes rimmed with fatigue. At times, she found herself thinking about endings in a way that made the air thin. She did not act. Instead, some nights she stopped the world by not breathing deeply, letting herself become very small. Those nights were the hardest. Once, she woke at dawn with a memory that felt like being saved by sheer routine. An old neighbor dropping off a casserole out of habit, a child's giggle from a passing window. She understood she did not yet have permission to leave the threads that still attached her. There was a turning. Sometimes turning comes as a bruise so deep you cannot ignore it. Sometimes it comes through the offer of help, the kind that is awkward and unglamorous. Claire was taken in by a shelter with a program, a therapist named Dr. Loop. Alina Morales, a woman with calm hands and a voice that could cradle both anger and softness. There were group sessions in a room with folding chairs, coffee-stained mugs, and fluorescent lights. The first time Claire sat down, she felt like an actor in a scene that had nothing to do with her. Then someone told a story that was not unique, but sounded like confession. And it crossed her like a key finding a lock. She was not the only one who had made the kind of mistake that looks like desertion. Recovery did not arrive as a single luminous day. It showed up in small increments. 3 consecutive nights of sleeping without panic, 2 weeks without the compulsive avoidance that used to fill her minutes. She was required to do more than simply say sorry, to take things like therapy and a vocational class seriously. The program offered woodworking lessons as part of a skills track. It seemed almost funny to Claire at first, from broken months to sawing planks. But in a room that smelled of sawdust, she found a new kind of ritual. The sound of a file over wood, the give of a plane, the arc of a chisel, these were immediate, honest. The craft demanded attention, and attention erases the worst kinds of rumination. She carved small boxes at the workshop. In the beginning, they were clumsy. Uneven edges, a lid that stuck. Over months, the boxes learned to close smoothly. She sanded once until the wood was warm in her hands. She learned the patience of a join. The small boxes became her way of holding things, a receipt, a pebble, a note. She made one for herself, plain, with a faint heart burned into the underside of the lid. It became an altar for a particular kind of apology not yet given. At night, she began to write. At first, the letters were for no one. She filled pages with the small history of shame. What she did, why she fled, the ordinary failures that made the extraordinary choice seem possible. She wrote not to make herself feel noble, but to make the shame sensible, to fit it into lines that could be read and folded. She practiced sentences that did not ask for absolution. "I cannot change what I did," she wrote in one, the pen moving with the slow tremor of a hand relearning confidence. "I can tell you what I remember." Those drafts were messy. They were not pleas. They were not bargaining. They were a ledger. One night she placed a letter in an envelope and sat with it like a sleeping child. She thought about the consequences of sending it, how someone else might weaponize it, how it might reopen clean, sharp wounds in a life that had carefully learned the contours of safety. She could not know the rightness of it. She could only know she needed to say what was true. Her first letter read like the sober, halting reconstructions she had learned in therapy. Short sentences, no dramatic metaphors. A small, trembling confession. "I am Claire. I left you at the bus stop when you were 7. I am sorry. I have been trying to live better. If you want nothing to do with me, I will respect that. If you would like to know why, I will tell you. But only if you ask." She folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, and with hands that had learned steadier motions from the plane and file, she sealed it with a practiced thumb. Michael received the envelope one rainy afternoon much later. He had been sifting through negligence and triumph, kids' artwork, a bill, a note from school, when the letter, addressed in a careful, small hand with a name he did not know, landed on his doormat. The return address was a shelter's, postage neat. For a long moment he held it and felt the slow, private stir that comes when past meets present. He read the letter in the kitchen, over the sink where sunlight, thin and pale, cut across the counter. He read the words Claire had written, the admission, the apology, the quiet request for nothing more than a chance to be known. He felt, sharply and honestly, the tug of his own stake in the story. He had been Jonah's protector, the person who had stepped into the breach and signed papers to make safety legal. He had built a world for the boy that meant stability in ways the boy had not yet learned to name. He had watched Jonah fall asleep under the same blanket for years. He knew the child's flush of anger at being teased, the triumph of a good test score, the way that boy's fingers would, absent-mindedly, line up small objects to count them by twos. He also read the simplest line, a line that was not meant to change him, but to introduce a person who had meant the world to that boy once. "If you would like to know why, I will tell you, but only if you ask." The sentence sat between other sentences like a hinge. Michael considered his options. There was the legal prudence, consulting a social worker, bringing the agency into the loop, protecting Jonah from anything that might unsettle the home they had made. There was the human response, withholding punishment that he himself would never want meted out to someone with real remorse. He thought about the day he had found Jonah at the bus shelter. He remembered the small, stunned trust in that boy's eyes, and the way the child had curled his fingers around the strap of the backpack like a talisman. He went to Jonah's room that evening and watched him stack pieces of a math game, brow furrowed with concentration. The boy did not look up at first. He was used to Michael's routine. When Jonah finally glanced toward the doorway, Michael sat down on the edge of the bed and held the envelope out like a question. Jonah took the letter with a careful, reverent touch, as if it might contain a treasure or a trap. He read the first line out loud, "My name is Claire," then hesitated. The syllables fell into the room like unfamiliar weather. He looked at Michael, eyes wide and even. "Who is she?" he asked. Michael could have kept the answer clinical, protective. "Someone from your past." He could have rerouted the conversation into abstractions about families and choices. But Jonah had the right to a truth that did not erode the safety Michael and Evelyn had built. Michael inhaled and said, simply, "She is the woman who was with you that day at the bus stop. She is your birth mother." Jonah's face, so used to the steady light of certainty, eclipsed for a moment by a cyclone of feelings that had no name yet. He read the words again, this time more slowly, and then sat very still, as if listening for something that might come through the walls. For Michael, that stillness contained gratitude, fear, and a new responsibility. Gratitude because the boy had been given a life that worked. Fear because history had no straightforward rules. Responsibility because the world of a child is fragile, and any answer they offered would need to honor both the safety of the present and the truth of the past. That night, Michael placed the letter on his desk, next to a notebook where he kept reminders to be kind and careful with Jonah's heart. He did not decide what to do yet. He slept, and for the first time in a long time, his dreams were less tidy, boarded not by graphs or the shape of a deal, but by a small boy counting with his fingers, asking a question that had the potential to splinter or to heal. Across town, Claire placed a tiny carved box into an envelope alongside a photograph she had kept folding for years. It was not a grand offering. The box had a lid she had sanded until it fit like a promise. Inside, she tucked a scrap of fabric, a small airplane she had stitched in a workshop one rainy afternoon. It smelled faintly of sawdust and varnish. She addressed the envelope with a nervous hand, walked to the post box, and let the world carry her confession. When she stepped back into the shelter and sat by the communal table, she felt the land shift novels describe: small, tectonic, inevitable. She had done something that she had imagined might shame her further. Instead, she felt hollowed out in a way that could make space for new things. In the group that week, she read parts of the letter aloud, her voice quivering while the others listened, some with unspoken warnings, and others with the kind of mercy that becomes known in rooms full of shared mistakes. "You did the work," Dr. Elena told her afterward, and the encouragement landed in her chest like rain. "You chose to make reparation, even when it's uncertain." Reparation is not always about outcomes. Sometimes it is an action that modifies the actor, not the environment. Claire knew this. She also knew that there was a life out there that had been shaped without her, by people who had made different choices. For all her desire, there was no entitlement to the boy's forgiveness. To expect it would be to coerce grace. She had learned, slowly, painfully, not to demand absolution. Jonah sleepwalked in those days through questions he could not name. He kept the letter folded in a drawer like a live thing. He unwrapped it sometimes, read a sentence, and reread it like learning a new word. He would take out the photograph and press his thumb to the fold where the paper had been pressed for years. To him, the concept of forgiveness had the slippery feel of a cloud, above him, but not something he could reach without climbing. In school, a teacher named Miss Ellen asked him once to write a story about someone who had made a mistake and then tried to fix it. Jonah wrote about a man who left the gate open and then built a stronger fence. He wrote the ending with a neat, resolute hand. Miss Ellen circled his punctuation with a star and wrote, "Tender and brave, keep writing." The praise did not explain the missing part of his life, but it fed him like a small, warming thing. Weeks later, when Michael finally placed a reply on his kitchen table, he did not write with the urgent nobility of a man who believed that single sentences could settle complex moral debts. He wrote, in a slow and careful hand, that he had received the letter, that he had read it, that Jonah had seen it, and that whatever came next needed to prioritize Jonah's well-being. He invited Claire, if she wished, to write more, to tell her story in small pieces, and promised that no meeting would be arranged without Jonah's full consent. The reply was cautious, a scaffolding rather than a bridge. Michael sealed the envelope and hesitated, understanding fully that some doors open toward reconciliation and others close hard to protect what has been built. He thought about how he would hold both truths, that Jonah belonged to the life he had made for him, and that the life that had birthed Jonah deserved a hearing. It was possible, he believed, for people to hold multiple loyalties without dissolving them. When Claire received the reply, she sat on the steps of the shelter and read Michael's words until the letters blurred. The first response was not a meeting, it was a boundary wrapped in kindness. She felt something soft and dangerous stir inside her. Hope. Not the kind that demands, but the kind that waits with hands folded. She began to write again. In the weeks that followed, small rituals knitted into the widening fabric of their lives. Jonah took out his math homework and in the margins sometimes scribbled a question that was not about numbers. He began, with the shy bravery of a child exploring a new path, to ask more about where he had come from. Not to take anything away from Michael and Evelyn, but to build a fuller map of himself. Claire learned to attend meetings, to arrive on time, to accept the slow medicine of consistency. 3 months of steady volunteering at a community garden, regular attendance at therapy groups, the daily practice of sanding a surface until it lost its roughness. The carved box stayed in a drawer at Claire's shelter bed. She wrote letters stitched with the simple, brave honesty she had practiced. Each envelope included a small object, a pressed leaf, a pebble from a place she had walked to when she needed to be near clean air, a scrap of fabric that smelled like home. She did not expect these tokens to change a life. She made them as evidence that she could still make things that were whole. One evening, Michael found Jonah sitting at the kitchen table, the letter open in front of him. His fingers had smudged the ink slightly. Jonah looked up, eyes steady, as if he had been rehearsing a question. "Dad," Jonah said, and the word was heavy with something that had been folding itself up for years. "What does it mean when someone says they're sorry?" Michael felt the weight of that question unfold along the old familiar lines of protector and parent. He had answers that were practical and moral, but here, in the small, bright kitchen, the answer had to be human. He told Jonah that apology meant acknowledging harm and trying to repair it, that sometimes people cannot fix what they broke, but they can change how they live. Jonah listened, and then, with the hush of someone making a brave crossing, asked, "Can I meet her?" The question hung like a bell. There was no rush in Michael's reply. He could feel the responsibility in his chest like a pulse. He said, "We will think about it together. We'll take it slow." That slow was a place that both comforted and terrified every adult who loved that boy. Slow meant time to prepare, to set boundaries, to find a neutral place where nothing would be demanded that Jonah could not give. Slow meant ensuring that whatever happened next would be for Jonah's sake alone. On the other side of the city, Claire read the words Michael had sent and folded them into her palm like a talisman. She did not expect permission. She expected to be patient, to keep building a life that could, someday, meet the life she had left. She sanded the edges of a new box that evening until the grain looked soft as skin. She wrote another letter, shorter, filled with things she could say without asking for forgiveness. I go to meetings. I have a job that keeps my hands steady. I am here if you ever want to know me. The story did not mend in a single season. There were months of exchange that were careful, measured, letters that read like fragments of a bridge under construction. There were visits that the social worker oversaw at first. A neutral room with soft chairs, a pot of tea, a window that watched a public garden. In those trials, both sides learned to listen in different ways. Claire learned to leave space in her sentences for the boy's autonomy. Michael learned to hold his protector's mantle lightly enough that it would not crush curiosity. And Jonah looked at his two lives like a map with two overlapping territories. He began to understand that love is not a single line. Sometimes it is a room with more than one bed. He discovered that his forgiving was not an erasure, but a bridge. That saying, "I forgive you," did not mean he had to forget. It meant he could add someone into a fuller story without losing the people who had been constant. There were moments of awkwardness, Claire's hands shaking when Michael first brought a thermos of coffee to the meeting room. Jonah's small laugh when Claire told him a dull joke because she wanted him to see her sense of humor. There were also moments heavy with old pain. Jonah listening when Claire explained that she had been afraid, that shame had closed her down in a way she could not make sense of then. One object threaded through these early reunions like a whisper, the little carved box Claire had made. Michael kept it out of practical caution, but Jonah, curious as children are with things passed through time, opened it once under the watchful gaze of both adults and found a scrap of fabric and a pressed leaf. He kept the box on his desk after the meeting, a small piece of the past that did not demand anything, only presence. Time did not clear everything. It did, however, layer on a different kind of texture. Patience, accountability, the honest press of ordinary actions. Claire began to volunteer at the woodworking shop where she had learned her craft, teaching others the way someone had taught her, with precise hands, with the authority of someone who had been handed the chance to try again. She took a job that paid modestly but honestly. She paid her dues in small checks that eventually built a cabinet and then a shelf, and then the idea of a life that could hold a child's visits. Michael watched these changes with the cautious optimism he had been schooled in by life. Reputations shift slowly, and people take time to prove a pattern. He observed Claire's consistency, the monthly meetings, the letters that arrived without expectation. He watched Jonah, who slept better as he eased into a new, plural identity, as if knowing more of his origin had not diminished the love he had, but deepened it. The narrative did not have a sudden finality. Instead, it moved like a river, negotiating stones. Sometimes a rock forced the water to break and roar. Sometimes it smoothed the current until the surface was glass. The real work of redemption was in the long arc of repeated kindnesses, in the stubborn daily practice of work and therapy, in the refusal to let a single decision be the final sentence of a life. And then, several months after the first letter, Jonah held a new envelope, and this time he looked at Michael in a way that made the adult understand the gravity of a child's consent. His voice was small and steady. "I want to meet her," he said. The sentence was the hinge of something enormous and delicate. Michael felt a sudden clarity. Preparation mattered, as did the presence of a social worker, as did the place where they would meet. Nothing about reconciliation would be spontaneous. Everything about it had to be deliberate. They agreed on a park, neutral ground, with benches and a map of other lives in the people who passed through. Claire would come with the support of Dr. Elena and the social worker. Michael would bring Jonah. Evelyn would be within reach, but not in the frame, to give Jonah space to make his own decisions. They would sit, they would speak, and they would let silence have equal weight. On the morning of the meeting, the park smelled of damped earth and cut grass. The bench where they sat was worn smooth by other people's stories. Claire arrived early and sat with her hands in her lap, the carved box on the bench beside her like an offering that did not demand acceptance. When Jonah came, he moved with the purposeful awkwardness of a child who has seen too many grown things, but still carries the courage to ask a difficult question. The first exchange was small. Claire told Jonah she remembered the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck, the way he had held his backpack as if it were a fortress. Jonah listened, and then, with astonishing grace, asked, voice half smile, "Did you ever think about me?" Claire looked at him so hard that her eyes filled, and she breathed every day. She did not ask to be forgiven. She simply told the truth she had been carrying for years. Jonah's response was not the sweeping absolution of stories that end with dramatic reunions. Instead, he said, slowly, "I'm angry sometimes, but I'm also glad you're alive." The words were a map in themselves, part accusation, part invitation. Michael sat quietly, the role he had taken at the bus stop years ago folding into something more complex now. Guardian, steward, someone learning to share the space of a child's heart. There would be other meetings, guarded, structured, sometimes joyful, sometimes brittle. There would be letters that asked for nothing and letters that asked for everything. There would be setbacks. Claire missing a meeting because her bus broke down. Jonah withdrawing for a week after a twinge of panic. Michael needing to remind himself that protection is not possession. But there was also a slow, patient remaking. Claire learning the names of the people who tended Jonah at school. Jonah learning to place his two lives side by side without collapsing one into the other. Michael learning to listen in the thin space between past wounds and present care. At the center of all that, the carved wooden box changed hands a few times. Jonah once placed it on his shelf, next to a stack of math trophies. He would open it and sometimes find a letter, sometimes a leaf, sometimes nothing at all. The emptiness was not absence, but possibility. The story, at its core, was not about a single choice, but about what people did afterward. The refusal to repeat old mistakes, the slow accretion of small, ordinary acts that become a life. Redemption was not a headline. It was a ledger of daily decisions, showing up, attending meetings, keeping promises, sanding a jagged edge until it no longer caught at skin. When the park meeting ended that afternoon, they did not embrace in the cathartic way of movies. Claire did not demand more from Jonah than he had offered. Jonah did not renounce his anger. They sat and watched the sun lower itself behind the trees while a dog chased a ball across the grass. Michael walked Jonah to the car, and Claire watched them go, fingers closed around the carved box until the wood warmed to her palm. On the drive home, Jonah asked tentatively, "Will she come again?" Michael glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "If you want her to," he said, "we'll do this on your terms." Jonah folded that answer into himself like a pocket. It was, in the end, a gift. The sense that forgiveness and reconciliation are not coerced, but chosen. That a child's capacity for compassion can both open and set limits. There were still important things left undone. The deeper conversations about the years between that bus stop and Claire's recovery, the legal formalities around contact, the long season of trust that would have to be painstakingly earned. The story's next chapter would need patience, dignity, and the willingness to carry complexity without collapsing into the simple narratives the world likes. For now, in the quiet that followed the meeting, each of them carried a small thing. Jonah carried a piece of paper, folded once and stuffed into his pocket. Claire carried a carved box, sanded smooth by hands that had learned to steady themselves. Michael carried the weight of a choice he had made years before, to cross a street and stay, and the knowledge that choices ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Outside, life kept happening in steady increments. The bus routes, the coffee shops, the people who passed benches without seeing the quiet dramas unfolding on them. Inside, quietly and persistently, the work of rebuilding began. If this story has touched you, consider subscribing and sharing. What does forgiveness mean to you? Must it be earned, or can it be freely given? Inside, quietly and persistently, the work of rebuilding began. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that was neither dramatic nor seamless. Claire's days acquired a steady architecture. Early mornings sweeping the small studio where she now worked, afternoons at the community woodworking shop teaching a beginner's class, evenings at group meetings where she learned the language of patience and accountability anew. The little carved box, once clumsy and full of longing, became her calling card. People who could not afford the pricier crafts bought her simple keepsakes. Others paid just enough to keep the bills moving forward. She kept precise notebooks with a ledger of expenses and a plan for slow growth. This was one of the practical lessons she had learned in recovery. Honesty with numbers, like honesty with memory, made a life possible. Jonah watched those notebooks with the detached curiosity of a child who liked to see patterns. He would pop into the shop after school sometimes, math club was not far from the community center, and ask about measurements or glues. Michael and Evelyn encouraged the visits. They trusted that familiarity with Claire's work, without pressure, could help Jonah fold his two lives together without tearing either apart. Slowly, Jonah's interest shifted from observation toward participation. He liked the geometry of the boxes, the way angles fit, and how a fraction of an inch could make a lid either stubborn or kind. One rainy Tuesday, he sat with a pad and pencil and sketched plans until his fingers smudged the graphite. "You should sell ones with compartments," he said, voice tentative, and Claire looked at him as if she had been given both a design and a permission. "Compartment for what?" she asked, surprised and soft. "For things you don't want to lose," Jonah said, "like a letter." She smiled, and for a moment the years between them narrowed like a doorway opening. It was a small trade. She taught him the way to sand an edge until it ceased to scratch. He taught her a trick for dividing the interior space so a folded paper would lie flat. The labor of craft became a language they both could use when words felt risky. There were setbacks. Not grand collapses, nothing cinematic, but small tests that might have undone a weaker resolve. Once, Claire missed a scheduled visit because the bus she relied on never came, and the next one was too late for the time they had agreed upon. Jonah called Michael from school, confused and disappointed, and the beeping of that call felt like a thin, exposed wire. Claire, horrified at what the missed visit might mean, arrived 10 minutes after the scheduled time, cheeks flushed and eyes wet. She explained calmly, offered an apology that did not demand forgiveness, and handed Jonah a small wooden coin she had carved with the numbers 1 through 10, arranged like a tiny puzzle. "For when you count things you don't want to forget," she said. Jonah accepted it, but the slight tightness around his mouth that evening reminded Claire that consistency was the currency of trust. There were other tests of a less practical nature. A rumor about Claire's past circulated briefly in Jonah's class, an offhand remark overheard and exaggerated like juice left to boil. Jonah came home and closed the door behind him with more force than usual. He did not lash out. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with his math book open and his body rigid. Michael watched him, worry and a protective instinct braided together. That night, Jonah asked questions that had been turning in his mind for months, the hows and whys that are often noisier than the quiet of forgiveness. Claire answered simply and honestly when the time came. Dr. Elena had taught her the value of truth delivered with humility, and she used it now. She did not paint her past in kinder colors. She described scarcity without sensationalism, fear without theatrics. "I was scared," she said. "I made a terrible choice because being too scared felt like less of a life than nothing at all." Jonah listened. Sometimes a child's listening is more powerful than adult exonerations. It is an act of sovereignty, a vote cast quietly for how they will permit the past to shape them. Over months and then years, the daily ledger of Claire's life showed a different pattern than the one that had nearly swallowed her. She learned to file taxes on time, to keep a savings jar, to answer calls promptly. The woodworking students, who had once been wary, began taking pride in the small things they could finish. Claire's class filled with people who benefited from structure and the dignity of making something useful. When a local crafts fair offered her a table, she accepted with a tremor and a plan. Michael volunteered to help carry boxes, but he never stood at her stall as the patron turned to her first. He sold this new scene of independence to himself as the right thing, not as charity. Jonah grew as well, not merely bigger in body, but in the long way children come to know who they are. Numbers held him as ever. He was patient with proofs and delighted in the small miracles of fractions aligning. He also began to carry stories more lightly. He learned to bring the carved box to school for show and tell, to explain the process of sanding and joining in the confident voice of someone who had watched a patient hand do the same. When peers asked him where the box had come from, he answered plainly, "My birth mother made it." No drama, a little curious pride, a child's way of co-locating facts. One winter, when Jonah was 12, and the edge between childhood and adolescence made small things swell into larger anxieties, he won a prize at a regional math contest. The trophy, narrow and luminous, made him flush with a proud, ashamed joy. Claire stood at the back of the gym that night, wearing a coat that covered the circles under her eyes, hands stuffed into pockets. She did not want to draw attention. She was there because Jonah had asked, because he had not taken for granted that her presence might be dangerous to him. When his coach called his name and he ran up to receive the ribbon, he glanced toward the bleachers as if searching for an inhabitant of his past. He saw Claire, and, for a second so soft it might have been imagined, his face opened. Afterwards, people spilled into the frosted parking lot, parents leaning on cars and exhaling. Claire stayed where she was until Jonah found her near the back exit. She did not approach until he stepped away from the cluster of his teammates and slid a small arm around her waist, a boy actions hug, quick and practical. "You came," he said, as if that were a miracle. "I always will," she whispered, the words exact as a promise she had finally learned how to keep. Tears brightened her lashes. Jonah hugged her back with the proper reserve of a boy who was halfway embarrassed and halfway grateful. Standing there, the wind knifing at their cheeks, they were nothing like one family in the tidy sense, and everything like two peoples finding a way to exist without erasing the other. There were legalities, too. Less poetic, but just as consequential. Michael arranged, through a careful and respectful process, for supervised contact to transition slowly into more independent visits as Jonah expressed readiness. The social worker involved in the case, warm, practical, neither sentimental nor cold, helped mediate boundaries and suggested that every new step be accompanied by counseling support. Jonah accepted these structures as if they were rules of a game, sometimes an annoyance, sometimes a relief. He liked the way rules could make freedom meaningful. Claire's recovery remained, at its core, a practice. She did slips, missed a meeting, drank too much at a party she should have left sooner. Each misstep was met with accountability rather than resignation. She called Dr. Elena, she shared the slip with her group, she redoubled efforts to mend the place a small relapse might have nicked. These moments did not make headlines. They were private stitches. They were necessary evidence of an honest life rather than a headline story of triumph. As the years unrolled, the carved wooden box continued to travel between their lives. Jonah placed small things inside it. A ribbon from a school play, a tiny bus token from the first time he and Claire rode together to a museum, a leaf from a park where they had once watched the sunset. Claire tucked in pieces of paper, short remembrances, lists of things she loved about him when he was small, apologies that did not assume they would be accepted. Michael kept a copy of each letter, not for control, but as a record of a bridge he had helped preserve. An important winter came when Claire was invited to show her work at a small gallery. It was a modest honor, the kind that spoke to honest progress rather than sudden celebrity. She called Jonah, voice trembling with an ordinary fear. What would it feel like to be seen openly as the person who had once vanished? Jonah came, taking the bus with Michael, and they watched Claire stand near her pieces, describing the grain of the wood and the practice behind each joint. People listened. Some bought small items. A local paper ran a short piece about the community shop and mentioned Claire by name. That night, Sitting in Michael and Evelyn's kitchen with the TV murmuring something forgettable in the background, Jonah looked at Claire in a way that measured years and decided something. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small stack of folded papers, notes he had written in math camp, attempts at an algorithm for predicting good box proportions, observations about efficient joinery. "I want to help," he said simply. "I can help you with the numbers and the prices. We could make a list, see what sells, try a week, if you want." The offer was practical, utterly unromantic, and profoundly generous. Claire swallowed and felt gratitude like warmth. "I'd like that," she said, and the words were a true transaction, two people bartering trust through work. From then on, their collaboration became a small enterprise in the best sense, shared labor that required both of them. Jonah learned to keep inventory, to calculate margins, to price her labor in ways that honored cost and dignity. Claire learned to accept help that did not feel like charity, but like partnership. Michael watched the pair with an uneasy, eventual calm, the kind of parent who must learn to relinquish the absolute right to direct the terms of care so that the child's agency can grow. In time, Jonah's invitations into both households made the edges between them less brittle. He spent holidays that rotated like a gentle clock. Christmas at Michael and Evelyn's, a quiet Sunday brunch with Claire, sometimes a community garden planting where all three would work side by side.